Imagine standing in the desert at night with nowhere left to run. Behind you, the sound of chariots, iron wheels biting into sand, horses screaming, an army closing fast. In front of you, nothing but water. Not a river you can swim, not a lake you can walk around. An endless wall of black sea stretching beyond the horizon. You are trapped. This is the moment most people think they understand about the Exodus. The dramatic pause. Moses lifts his staff. The sea explodes apart like a movie scene. Instant miracle. Roll credits. But that is not what the Bible actually describes. And once you see what it really says, once you map it onto the real world, this story stops being a children's tale and turns into something far more unsettling, far more dangerous, and far more deliberate. Because the sea did not split instantly, it fought back first. According to the text, the night Moses stood before the water, God did not act with a flash of light or a sudden shockwave. Instead, the sea was pushed back slowly, relentlessly, hour after hour, by a powerful wind that blew all night long. Darkness, wind, waiting. The kind of waiting that makes people panic, doubt, and turn on their leader. And that detail changes everything. If this crossing happened by a gradual process, then location suddenly matters. Wind matters. Geography matters. Depth matters. Because some bodies of water can do this, and others absolutely cannot. This is where the story splits in two. On one side are those who believe the crossing happened close to Egypt, in shallow marshy lakes where reeds grow thick and water barely reaches your chest. Places where modern scientists have demonstrated a phenomenon called wind set-down, where sustained wind can push water aside and temporarily expose land beneath it. On the other side are those who believe the crossing happened far from Egypt, at the edge of a massive, terrifying body of water, one so deep that no human army could survive if it came crashing back. Only one of these locations fits every detail of the story. And here's the problem. Both sides sound convincing until you follow the story all the way through. Let's start with the shallow water theory. It sounds reasonable at first. Wind pushes water aside. Land appears, people cross. Wind stops, water rushes back. The Bible even says the water returned like walls on either side. But there's a fatal issue no one likes to talk about. The Egyptian army did not fall down, they drowned. The text is brutally clear. Chariots, horses, soldiers, every single one swallowed by the returning sea. Not scattered, not injured, gone. Not one of them remained. In shallow water, that doesn't happen. A wave might knock you over. Panic might spread. But trained soldiers in knee-deep or waist-deep water do not all drown at once. Especially not mounted troops. Yet the Bible insists they did. Which is why for centuries, artists, theologians, and filmmakers instinctively imagined something much larger. A crossing that inspired terror not just because of the enemy behind, but because of the impossible void ahead. That instinct leads to a second location, one most people don't even realize is part of the Red Sea system. Far to the southeast lies a gulf so deep it drops thousands of feet straight down. A body of water wide enough to swallow armies, narrow enough to trap a nation, and violent enough that when it returns, nothing survives. This location solves the drowning problem, but it creates another. Why would Moses lead the Israelites so far out of the way? Why march exhausted families, children, livestock, and elders into a region that looks like a dead end? And that question leads us to one of the most overlooked details in the entire Exodus narrative. When the Israelites reach the water, they don't just feel afraid, they feel betrayed. They cry out to Moses, accusing him of dragging them into a trap. They say it would have been better to die in Egypt than here. That level of panic only makes sense if escape was physically impossible, not difficult, impossible. Mountains pressing in, narrow valleys funneling them forward, water blocking the final exit. In other words, geography that corners them. And suddenly, that distant, massive body of water begins to make uncomfortable sense. But the real shift happens when you step back and ask a deeper question, one almost no one asks. Where was Moses before any of this started? The Bible tells us plainly, Moses wasn't in Egypt when God first spoke to him. He was living in Midian, tending sheep in the wilderness, far from Pharaoh, far from the Nile, far from civilization. And when God appeared to him in the burning bush, it wasn't in a city or a palace. It was on a mountain the Bible calls the mountain of God. That name matters. Because later, after the sea crossing, Moses leads the people to another mountain, where God descends in fire, thunder, and smoke, and delivers the 10 Commandments. And that mountain has the exact same title, the Mountain of God. The implication is staggering. The mountain where Moses first met God is the same mountain where the law was given, which means Moses did not travel hundreds of miles with his sheep into foreign territory just to stumble upon the burning bush. He was already near that mountain, already in that region, already in the land the Bible associates with Midian. And Midian is not in the Sinai Peninsula. It is across the sea. This single detail quietly undermines centuries of assumptions, because if Moses began his calling east of the sea and ended it at the same mountain, then the entire route of the Exodus shifts. The crossing point shifts. The scale of the miracle shifts. And suddenly, the idea of a small symbolic crossing collapses. What remains is something far more dangerous, a deliberate trap, a calculated confrontation, a night where the sea did not simply obey, but resisted, receded, waited, and then returned with lethal force. And this is only the beginning. Because once the people cross, the evidence doesn't stop at the shoreline. It continues into the wilderness, to places with no business holding water, no business holding graves, and no business holding the scars of fire, worship, and judgment. In the next chapter, we follow the trail beyond the sea into the desert, where the ground itself begins to tell a story that refuses to stay buried. If this is where God truly led them, then the Exodus was not just a rescue. It was a reckoning, and by the time we reach the mountain, the question won't be whether the story happened. It will be whether we were ever meant to see it this clearly. Once the sea closed behind them, logic says the danger should have ended. The army was gone. The chains were broken. The impossible had already happened. If this were a normal escape story, this is where relief would settle in and momentum would carry the people forward. That is not what happens. Instead, the story grows stranger, because the wilderness they enter behaves in ways wildernesses do not. The Bible says the Israelites moved away from the sea and into an arid, hostile region where survival itself became the next test. Water disappeared, food vanished, patience evaporated. The people who had just witnessed one of the greatest miracles in human history began to unravel almost immediately. And this is where geography starts whispering instead of shouting. One of the first places the Israelites stop is called Elim. The description is oddly specific. 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, sitting like an island of life inside a dead landscape. That kind of detail is unusual. Ancient texts rarely pause to count trees and springs unless the location itself matters. What's unsettling is that in the region east of the sea, far from the Sinai Peninsula, there is a rare oasis matching this description almost exactly. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, practically. Multiple natural springs, palm growth in an otherwise dry expanse. A place that would draw travelers, shepherds, and tribes like a magnet in a land where water determines everything. From there, the route moves deeper into desolation. The people grow desperate. So desperate they turn on Moses again, accusing him of leading them out, only to watch them die of thirst. At this moment, something happens that has puzzled scholars and skeptics alike for generations. God tells Moses to strike a rock. Water doesn't seep out. It doesn't drip. It doesn't pool slowly. It bursts forth. Enough water, the text implies, to satisfy an entire nation and their livestock. Enough force to leave lasting marks on stone. Here's where the wilderness stops behaving like a wilderness. In this same eastern region, explorers have identified a massive rock formation, towering, isolated, split cleanly down the middle. The base of the surrounding stone is smoothed in a way normally caused by prolonged, forceful water flow. That alone would be strange. But this is not a riverbed. There is no natural source upstream. No rainfall pattern capable of carving erosion like that in the middle of a dry desert. It looks like water passed through a place where water does not belong. Nearby, the ground tells another story. Scattered across the terrain are smooth, rounded stones, distinct from the jagged rocks common in deserts. Stones shaped for throwing, for slings, for combat. And that matters because the Bible says that shortly after water flowed from the rock, the Israelites were attacked by the Amalekites. A battle broke out in the open wilderness. Moses stood on a hill overlooking the fight, raising his hands as the outcome shifted with his strength. If this location truly hosted both water and conflict, it explains something archaeologists often struggle with. Why people would fight over a seemingly empty place. Because it wasn't empty. It was a lifeline. Water in the desert makes territory sacred and strategic at the same time. But the trail doesn't stop there. As the Israelites continue, the text says they approach the mountain where God would meet them. Not quietly, not privately, but in a way designed to terrify. Fire, smoke, thunder, lightning. A voice so overwhelming that the people beg Moses to speak for them instead. This mountain is not just a backdrop, it is central to everything that follows. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. While Moses is on the mountain, receiving the law, the people below panic again. They fear abandonment. Silence feels like rejection. And so they do the unthinkable. They recreate what they knew in Egypt. They melt their gold and form a calf. An image pulled straight from the religious culture they were supposed to have left behind. And they worship it. The response is swift and devastating. Judgment falls. Thousands die in a single day. Now pause and think about this. 3,000 bodies do not disappear quietly. They must be buried, mourned, removed from camp. And the Bible tells us the Israelites remained in this region for an extended period of time. So, where did the graves go? In the same eastern wilderness near the proposed mountain location, explorers have documented thousands of small stone burial markers scattered across the landscape. Not clustered like a village cemetery. Spread out, consistent with mass burials conducted quickly. No inscriptions, no dates, just presence. Nearby, carved into stone faces and rock walls, are images that unsettle even cautious observers. Figures resembling bovine shapes, horns, ritual postures. Art that looks uncomfortably similar to Egyptian religious symbolism. Does this prove anything on its own? No. But that's the point. None of this evidence screams certainty. It accumulates. A spring where there should be none. A split rock where water should not flow. Battle stones where armies should not fight. Graves where people should not have died. Symbols where worship should not have returned. Each piece alone could be coincidence. Together, they form a pattern that refuses to go away. And then there is the mountain itself. This mountain dominates the region. Darkened stone near its peak, as if scorched. A wide plain at its base, large enough to hold a massive encampment. Natural boundaries that match the description of where the people were told not to cross while God descended in fire. The Bible says, the mountain trembled. That word is not poetic. It implies physical force, a presence that altered the environment itself. What's striking is not that people disagree about this location. It's that once you place the events here, Once you let the story unfold in this terrain, the narrative suddenly moves without friction. Nothing feels forced. Nothing feels symbolic just to make a point. Everything feels dangerous, real. But this creates a problem. Because there is another mountain, one enshrined by tradition, pilgrimage, and centuries of assumption. A mountain marked on maps, taught in schools, and reinforced by history. And history carries weight. In the next chapter, we are going to confront that tradition head-on. We'll compare the mountain of memory with the mountain of evidence, and we'll look at one final detail, so subtle it's almost invisible, that may decide the entire debate. Not by archaeology, not by science, but by following Moses himself back to the moment before the sea ever moved. If you've stayed with me this far, you're already thinking differently about this story. And if you want to keep exploring history the way it was lived, not just the way it's been repeated, this is exactly the kind of journey this channel is built for. The final piece is closer than it seems. If this story were only about geography, it would have ended long ago. Maps could be debated, coordinates argued, evidence weighed and dismissed. But the Exodus was never just about where people walked. It was about why God led them the way he did. And the final piece of evidence doesn't come from the sea, the rock, the graves, or the mountain's appearance. It comes from Moses himself, long before plagues fell on Egypt, long before Pharaoh panicked, long before the sea ever moved. Moses was already living somewhere specific. The Bible tells us plainly that after fleeing Egypt, Moses settled in the land of Midian. He married there. He raised a family there. He worked as a shepherd there for decades. This wasn't a temporary stop. It was home. Shepherds do not wander randomly. They follow grazing routes, seasonal patterns, known water sources. A shepherd does not drive sheep hundreds of miles into hostile terrain for no reason, especially not across large bodies of water. And this is where the story quietly locks into place. When God finally speaks to Moses, he does not summon him to Egypt first. He appears to him while Moses is tending sheep. The burning bush is not in Egypt. It is not near the Nile. It is not in the Sinai Peninsula. It is on the mountain of God. That title matters more than most people realize, because later, after the plagues, after the escape, after the sea crossing, Moses brings the Israelites to a mountain with the exact same title, the mountain of God. The implication is unavoidable. God did not introduce himself to Moses at one mountain and then later choose a completely different one to reveal his law. The narrative treats these locations as the same sacred place. One calling, one mountain, one destination. If that mountain were in the Sinai Peninsula, then Moses would have had to take his sheep far outside their natural range, cross dangerous terrain, and possibly even traverse the sea itself just to encounter God. The text gives no hint of that. But if the mountain were in the land of Midian, east of the sea, then everything aligns naturally. Moses is already there. God appears there. And later, God brings his people back to the same place. Not because it was convenient, because it was intentional. This reframes the entire Exodus. The escape from Egypt was not simply about freedom, it was about return. God was not just removing Israel from oppression, he was bringing them to himself. That's why the route feels strange. That's why the path feels dangerous. That's why they were led into a trap. Because the point was never safety, it was surrender. When the Israelites reached the sea, they were forced to confront something terrifying. There was no way forward unless God acted. No strategy, no alternate route, no backup plan. And when they reached the mountain, the lesson deepened. The God who split the sea was not tame. The God who fed them was not negotiable. The God who rescued them was holy. Fire, thunder, boundaries, fear. The people begged Moses to speak for them because they realized something unsettling. They did not want direct access to a God like this. They wanted rescue. They wanted provision. But they were not prepared for presence. And that's where the golden calf makes sense. It wasn't just rebellion, it was an attempt to make God manageable, visible, predictable, familiar, something they could worship without trembling. That instinct hasn't changed. We still prefer smaller miracles, safer interpretations, less disruptive conclusions. A shallow crossing feels easier to accept. A symbolic sea feels less demanding. A distant mountain feels less confrontational. But the story itself resists being downsized. Every time someone tries to shrink it, another detail refuses to fit. The drowned army, the trapped people, the impossible water, the returning judgment, the mountain that burns, the God who speaks. And the final realization is this: if the Exodus really unfolded the way this evidence suggests, then God did not choose the smallest miracle possible. He chose the largest one necessary, not to impress Egypt, not to intimidate Pharaoh, but to permanently redefine how his people understood him. This was not about escape from slavery alone. It was about teaching a rescued people who they were now dealing with. A God who commands seas, a God who controls wilderness, a God who cannot be reshaped into comfort. That is why the location matters. Because if God parted a massive body of water, one no human could cross or survive, then the message is unmistakable. This was not chance. This was not exaggeration. This was not myth-making. This was a line drawn through history. And once you see it that way, the story stops asking whether you believe it happened. It asks whether you are willing to take seriously the kind of God it reveals. That's why this debate hasn't died. That's why the evidence keeps resurfacing. That's why the story still unsettles people thousands of years later. Because if this is true, then God does not simply guide people around obstacles. Sometimes he leads them straight into the impossible, so that when deliverance comes, there is no confusion about where it came from. If you've stayed with me through all 3 chapters, you're not just watching history, you're wrestling with it. And that's exactly what this channel is about. If you want more deep dives like this, where ancient stories meet real-world evidence and faith meets uncomfortable questions, make sure you subscribe. Because the most dangerous journeys in history are never the ones that take us away from danger. They're the ones that bring us face to face with the truth.